Tom Homan leaned back in his office chair, the sharp, musty scent of old leather filling his nostrils. The faint hum of fluorescent lights buzzed above, casting a cold, clinical glow over the piles of files stacked high on his desk. As a seasoned law enforcement officer, Homan had seen his share of corruption and deceit, but this was different. He had stumbled upon something so sinister, so deeply entrenched in the system that it made his blood run cold. It had started a month ago with a simple tip from an anonymous whistleblower, a frantic call from a staffer within the United States Agency for International Development, USAID. The voice, trembling yet resolute, whispered of misused funds, backdoor deals, and a massive election plot tied to none other than Representative Ilhan Omar. Homan had initially brushed it off as the ramblings of a disgruntled employee, but as he dug deeper, the pieces started to fall into place, painting a picture far more sinister than he could have imagined. He pored over the documents in front of him, funding records, travel logs, and intercepted communications, all pointing to a coordinated effort to divert millions in USAID funds to shell organizations with murky ties to Omar's political machine. The funds, meant for humanitarian aid and development in war-torn regions, were instead being funneled back into the U.S. to finance voter influence operations, online propaganda, and massive grassroots organizing efforts aimed at manipulating the upcoming elections. Homan's fists tightened around the edges of the file as he read a particularly damning transcript. It detailed a covert meeting between a key USAID contractor and a representative from Omar's campaign. The contractor spoke in careful, coded language about expanding influence and strengthening voter outreach, thinly veiled terms for what Homan knew was outright election interference. But that wasn't the worst of it. Homan had uncovered a network of nonprofit fronts, some with names as bland as Community Futures Alliance and Empower America Now, designed to mask the flow of millions in taxpayer dollars back into the pockets of political operatives. These organizations claimed to fund local community projects, but, in reality, were pumping cash into digital advertising campaigns and shadowy online operations designed to tilt the scales in Omar's favor. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he flipped through the final pages of the dossier. Here it was, the smoking gun, a signed memo from a USAID executive outlining plans to support targeted community outreach in key battleground states. The signature on the memo sent a jolt of adrenaline through Homan's veins. It was one of Omar's top campaign advisors, a person with direct access to her inner circle. Homan leaned back, his pulse pounding in his ears. This was no ordinary political scandal. This was a direct attack on the integrity of America's democratic system, and it had to be exposed. But he knew he couldn't do it alone. He needed allies, and he needed a platform to make his case, and there was no bigger stage than Congress. Homan slammed the file shut, his jaw set in grim determination. If he was going to bring this to light, he'd need to prepare for the fight of his life. The next morning, Tom Homan strode down the marble-floored corridors of the Capitol, his polished shoes clicking with the confidence of a man who had seen his share of battles. His grip tightened on the thick, leather-bound file clutched under his arm, the one containing the evidence he intended to present before Congress. It felt heavier than it should, burdened by the weight of the explosive truths it contained. As he passed the portraits of past American leaders lining the walls, he couldn't help but feel a surge of patriotism. This wasn't just about exposing a corrupt politician or reclaiming misused funds. This was about defending the very foundation of American democracy. He had seen too much during his years in law enforcement to let this slide. Too many good men and women had fought and died for the freedoms these walls represented. As he approached the chamber doors, a familiar face stepped into his path, Representative Jim Jordan, his brow furrowed in curiosity. "Tom, what are you doing here?" "I didn't hear you were testifying today," Jordan said, crossing his arms over his chest. Homan took a deep breath, his eyes locking with Jordan's. "Jim, we've got a serious problem, bigger than I thought. I need to speak before the Oversight Committee. Today." Jordan's eyes narrowed. He had known Homan long enough to trust his instincts, and the look on Homan's face told him this wasn't just another bureaucratic squabble. "All right, walk with me," Jordan said, turning on his heel and leading Homan down a side hallway. As they ducked into a small, windowless meeting room, Homan wasted no time, slapping the file down on the table and flipping it open. He quickly laid out the evidence, the funding records, the contractor logs, the damning memo signed by Omar's advisor. Jordan's eyes scanned the pages, his jaw tightening with each passing second. This is massive, Tom," Jordan whispered, his fingers tracing the edges of the memo. "If what you're saying is true, this is not just a scandal, it's a full-scale election manipulation plot. Homan nodded, his voice low but firm. It's bigger than just one election, Jim. This is about undermining the entire democratic process. If they can get away with this, what's stopping them from doing it again in 2028, 2032, and beyond? We need to stop this now. Jordan leaned back, his mind already racing with the political implications. This was more than just a headline. This was the kind of scandal that could shift the balance of power in Washington, ignite a media firestorm, and potentially end careers. We need to move quickly, Jordan said, standing abruptly. I'll pull some strings and get you in front of the committee this afternoon. But be prepared, Tom. Omar's not just going to roll over on this. She'll have every political operative and media ally she can muster lined up to discredit you. Homan cracked a small, humorless smile. Let them try. I faced worse. As Jordan moved to leave, he paused at the door, casting one last glance at Homan. You're doing the right thing, Tom. Just be careful. Homan nodded, his eyes hard. I always am. As the door clicked shut, Homan leaned back in his chair, his mind already racing through the hundreds of possible ways this could play out. He knew one thing for certain, this was about to be the fight of his life, and he would need every ounce of his grit and determination to see it through. By mid-afternoon, the corridors of the Capitol buzzed with a nervous energy. Whispers of Homan's sudden appearance had spread like wildfire, stirring curiosity and unease among lawmakers. The Oversight Committee chamber, usually a place of dry bureaucratic debates, now crackled with anticipation. News had leaked that Tom Homan, the no-nonsense former ICE director, was about to make a bombshell revelation, and every seat in the room was filled with journalists, staffers, and political operatives. Homan sat at the witness table, his back straight and his face set in a steely expression. He glanced over the crowd, catching the intense, watchful eyes of Ilhan Omar from her seat on the committee. She leaned back, her arms crossed, a faint, unreadable smile playing at the corners of her mouth. If she was worried, she hid it well. The gavel came down with a sharp crack, and Chairman James Comer's voice rang out, "This session of the House Oversight Committee is now in order. We have before us today Mr. Tom Homan, a respected figure in law enforcement and a former director of U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Mr. Homan, you have requested this platform to address a matter of grave national importance. You may proceed." Homan leaned into the microphone, his deep voice echoing through the chamber. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I come before you today not as a former federal official, but as an American citizen deeply concerned about the integrity of our democratic processes." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the room. He could feel the collective breath of the audience, hanging on his every word. "In recent weeks, I have uncovered disturbing evidence that points to a coordinated effort to misuse taxpayer dollars intended for international development through USAID. These funds, meant to alleviate suffering in some of the world's most impoverished regions, have instead been funneled back into the United States to support covert political operations." The murmurs in the room grew louder, reporters scribbling furiously in their notepads, cameras flashing. Omar's eyes narrowed, her fingers tapping rhythmically on the table. Homan continued, his voice rising with righteous anger. "These operations, hidden behind a web of shell nonprofits and front organizations, are designed to influence our elections, manipulate voters, and ultimately undermine the voice of the American people. And I have reason to believe that Representative Ilhan Omar's campaign is directly involved." A collective gasp swept through the room. Omar leaned forward, her face tightening, but she remained silent, her eyes locked on Homan like a hawk. Homan reached for the thick file in front of him, flipping it open. "What I have here are financial records, contractor logs, and internal communications that paint a damning picture. This document," he held up a stapled packet, "is a signed memo from a senior USAID executive outlining a plan to support targeted community outreach, a thinly veiled reference to political organizing in key battleground states." He tossed the packet onto the table in front of him, the papers making a sharp slap as they hit the polished wood. "The signature on this memo belongs to one of Representative Omar's top advisors, a person directly connected to her campaign." Omar's face remained stoic, but Homan caught a flicker of something in her eyes, a momentary break in her calm facade. He pressed on, his words like hammer blows. "These are taxpayer dollars, ladies and gentlemen, your money, my money, being siphoned off to undermine the very foundation of our democracy. This is not just unethical, it's illegal." Homan leaned back, his breathing steady but his heart pounding with adrenaline. He had thrown down the gauntlet, laid bare the depths of the scandal, and now all that remained was to see how the chamber would react. The room erupted into chaos, voices clashing, cameras flashing, the chairman's gavel pounding desperately to restore order. But in the eye of the storm, Homan remained still, his eyes locked with Omar's, both of them silently daring the other to make the next move. As the clamor in the chamber slowly subsided, Chairman Comer cleared his throat, his voice cutting through the chaos. Order. I will have order in this chamber. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing at Homan. Mr. Homan, these are serious allegations. Do you have the evidence to back up these claims? Homan met his gaze without flinching. Yes, Mr. Chairman. Every word. The documents I just submitted outline a direct financial link between USAID funds and political operations connected to Representative Omar's campaign. Omar, her eyes flashing with barely contained fury, leaned into her microphone. Mr. Homan, this is a blatant smear. You come in here with half-baked conspiracy theories and expect us to take you seriously? You have no proof, just innuendo and baseless accusations. Homan's jaw tightened. He had anticipated this, the counterattack, the attempts to discredit him. He flipped through his stack of documents, pulling out another packet. With all due respect, Congresswoman, this is not a theory. This is cold, hard evidence. He held up a sheet for the cameras to capture, his voice steady and unyielding. This document, he said, tapping the page, is an internal memo from a USAID contractor explicitly stating that funds earmarked for international relief were redirected to shell nonprofits operating within the United States. These funds were then funneled into digital marketing campaigns targeting key battleground states, campaigns directly linked to your political machine. Omar's lips tightened, her eyes darting toward the cluster of aides behind her, their faces growing pale as the gravity of Homan's claims sank in. She leaned forward, her tone icy. And what exactly are you suggesting, Mr. Homan? That I somehow masterminded a multimillion-dollar election plot? That's absurd. Homan leaned forward, his voice dropping to a deadly calm. I'm suggesting, Congresswoman, that you knowingly allowed taxpayer funds, money meant to feed the hungry and rebuild war-torn communities, to be used for your political gain. That you or someone in your inner circle coordinated this effort knowing full well it violated federal election laws. The room fell silent, the weight of Homan's accusations settling over the assembly like a dense fog. Even the typically unflappable chairman seemed momentarily stunned by the sheer audacity of Homan's charge. Omar's face hardened, her eyes narrowing into a cold, calculating stare. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, Homan spoke again, his voice rising. And if that's not enough, he continued, slapping down another set of papers, I have here a transcript of a conversation between one of your top aides and a senior USAID official discussing how to optimize the flow of funds to ensure maximum community engagement in key districts. This is not charity work, Congresswoman, this is political engineering on a massive scale. Omar's hands clenched into fists on the table in front of her, her breathing visibly sharp as she processed the blow. Homan had just crossed a line, he had moved from implication to direct accusation, and the room felt it. Before she could fire back, Chairman Comer interjected, his tone cautious but firm. Representative Omar, you will have the opportunity to respond. But for now, I would like to hear the rest of Mr. Homan's statement. Omar leaned back, her jaw clenched so tightly that the tendons stood out in her neck, her eyes locked on Homan with a fury that could melt steel. But Homan merely straightened in his seat, his resolve hardening. He had come this far, and there was no turning back now. The chamber had fallen into a tense, uneasy silence. The air felt thick, charged with the electric anticipation of a political clash unlike any seen in recent memory. Cameras whirred, reporters whispered into their microphones, and the eyes of the nation seemed to fix on the Oversight Committee room where a former law enforcement officer had just thrown down a gauntlet that could shake the foundations of Washington. Homan took a deep breath, his eyes never leaving Omar's. He could see the thin sheen of sweat on her brow, the slight tremble in her hands. She was rattled but far from defeated, a cornered fighter calculating her next move. Chairman Comer leaned into his microphone, his voice cutting through the charged silence. Mr. Homan, if you have additional evidence to present, I suggest you do so now. Homan nodded, his fingers flipping through the last of the documents in his stack. Mr. Chairman, in addition to the financial records and contractor memos, I have here a series of emails obtained through a whistleblower within USAID. These emails detail explicit coordination between senior officials at USAID and high-level members of Representative Omar's campaign. He held up one particularly damning page, its text highlighted in bold yellow. In this exchange, dated just 2 months before the midterms, a senior USAID official discusses redirecting funds to a community outreach project in Omar's district, specifically mentioning the importance of shoring up local support. A thinly veiled reference to voter mobilization. The room erupted again, voices overlapping in a chaotic chorus of shock and disbelief. The cameras zoomed in, capturing every detail of Homan's unflinching expression, every twitch of Omar's clenched jaw. Comer raised his gavel, bringing it down with a resounding crack. Order. I will have order. He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto Omar. Representative Omar, these are serious allegations. You have the floor to respond. Omar leaned into her microphone, her voice sharp and cutting. Mr. Chairman, this is a farce. A politically motivated smear campaign designed to distract from the real issues facing this country. Mr. Homan has presented nothing but baseless allegations and cherry-picked documents, none of which have been properly vetted or verified. She straightened, her gaze shifting to the cameras, her voice rising with each word. This is nothing more than an attempt to silence a progressive voice, a voice that stands for marginalized communities, for immigrants, for the oppressed. This is not about election integrity, this is about silencing dissent. Homan felt a flicker of doubt ripple through the room. Omar was a skilled orator, a veteran of countless political battles, and she knew how to turn a crisis into a rallying cry. But Homan wasn't finished. With all due respect, Congresswoman, he said, his voice cutting through her impassioned speech. This is not about silencing anyone. This is about accountability. About ensuring that taxpayer dollars are used for their intended purpose, not to manipulate elections or enrich political allies. Omar's eyes narrowed. Her jaw set in a hard line. For a moment, it seemed as though the room itself held its breath. The entire scene frozen in a tense standoff. Then Homan delivered his final blow. And if you doubt the authenticity of these documents, I welcome an independent forensic audit. Let the truth come out in full view of the American people. The chamber fell silent, the weight of Homan's challenge hanging in the air. Omar's eyes flicked briefly to the aides behind her, their faces pale, their eyes wide with panic. She knew, as did everyone else in the room, that such an audit could spell the end of her political career if Homan's allegations proved true. Chairman Comer leaned back, his eyes flicking between Homan and Omar, weighing the potential fallout. He cleared his throat, his voice low but firm. This committee will review the evidence presented today and take appropriate steps to ensure the integrity of our democratic processes. This hearing is adjourned. As the gavel came down, the room erupted into a chaotic flurry of movement. Reporters shouting questions, staffers scrambling to gather their notes, and Omar storming out of the chamber, her face a mask of tightly controlled fury. Homan watched her go, his heart still pounding in his chest, but a sense of grim satisfaction settling over him. He had done what he came to do. He had exposed the truth. Now, it was up to the American people to decide what came next.